I want to acknowledge our university and community supporters, the University of Iowa's international programs and the University of Iowa's honors program. They contribute vital time, talent, and logistics to our organization. I also thank the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their financial support, and I thank today's special financial sponsors, Karen and Wally Chapel, and Midwest One Bank. So at this point, I am very pleased to introduce my friend and fellow ICFRC member, Dr. James Rubie Watson. Woody was one of the first students to study Chinese at the University of Iowa, earning a BA in 1965. He subsequently received his Ph.D. in 1972 from the University of California at Berkeley, and until his retirement in 2011, he was Fairbank Professor of Chinese Society and Professor of Anthropology at Harvard University. Woody also taught at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, as well as at the Universities of Pittsburgh, Hawaii, and Houston. Together with his wife, Dr. Rubie Watson, he conducted anthropological research in Hong Kong's New Territory since the late 1960s. His publications include Emigration and the Chinese Lineage, Kinship Organizations in China, Death Rituals in China, The Cultural Economy of Food and Eating, and The Golden Arches East, McDonald's in East Asia. The Watsons are currently jointly authoring a book entitled The Last Colony, Everyday Life in British Hong Kong, 1898 to 1997. So please join me in welcoming Dr. James Rubie Watson.
Thank you very much. Karen, I will disappoint you. I don't intend to talk about Hooters today. But first, I want to thank members of the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council for inviting me to speak today, and to Ed for organizing everything so well, as usual. It's particularly nice to be introduced by Karen, a friend and Elk Run neighbor in the condo system up here. So let's begin. We have here the discussion today of nationalism in a particular form, namely having to do with culinary issues. But nationalism in all of its ugly forms is, alas, front and center in the world politics today. We all know that. For some of us, this is a startling and unwelcome return to an earlier era. And as my students would have said, just around the turn of the century, they would have said, and it's oh so 20th century to be concerned about nationalism again. Didn't we think that we were more or less done with this? Well, here we go again. This time around, food is very much at issue. So let's begin with our own politics and plans for the wall. And here we have, of course, Driscoll's strawberries, and you will look at it, you can see that it's a product of Mexico. Rubie and I purchased this in our nearby Hy-Vee in Galesburg, near our retirement farm. So the question is, Mexican strawberries, and Mexico has become a leading exporter of fresh food to the United States. And as we'll see, we are leading exports to Mexico in another domain of food. And the links between Mexico and the United States in terms of food and manufacturing and processing is very complex indeed. And touching it is going to really disrupt major chains in the economy. Furthermore, Mexico is the leading importer of U.S. yellow corn that it uses for livestock. And much of the pork that we eat derives from there. And the New York Times has been following this. If you're interested, to be careful, you can track it. Mexican officials are now thinking about imports from Argentina and Brazil, which, of course, both countries are now ramping up their agricultural sector, licking their chops about what's going to happen to NAFTA. Mexico, by the way, is self-sufficient in white corn for human consumption. But that's another issue. Now, if you look at the history of food fights, some of you will remember this from 2003, when the U.S. Congress dining hall decided that French fries were henceforth to become freedom fries. This was in response to the French opposition to the American invasion of Iraq. Many of these kind of episodes you can find on the internet. And you have to ask yourself, what's next? A ban on hummus? What about renaming falafel? Or so far, we've not seen any boycotts of Mexican-style foods in this country. But given the political climate, it could happen. So I suggest we watch for it. Anti-Taco Tuesday or something like that. Well, the Chinese have been also deep into food boycotts and food politics. This says in Chinese, it says boycott American goods. And if you look carefully, it's Coca-Cola, KFC, McDonald's, and I don't know what that is. Mercedes? What is that? Motorola. Okay, good. Thank you. Well, this is from Beijing University, Beida, in 1999 in response to the American bombing of the Chinese embassy in Serbia. And there have been lots of other episodes like this as well. I could fill up the entire hour by just looking at these kind of posters that I've collected and some of my students have collected. But we have other issues. I want to talk about three main problems today in discussing culinary nationalism. The first is the American fast food chain McDonald's, which I've been studying for a very long time. And the next is rice and the national identity in Asia, about who eats what kind of rice. And then my third topic is going to be the international trade in GMO soybeans and non-GMO soybeans. First of all, McDonald's worldwide. It's now in 119 countries. Of course, the United States is biggest. You notice that it has over 14,000 restaurants, followed by Japan, and then China and Germany. And if you look at the list going down, it's somewhat surprising. I always wonder, how did France get in there as number 5, especially if you follow the protests in France against McDonald's. And then the UK, Canada, Australia, and finally, Russia. And I think that's on the list. One of my graduate students has been tracking McDonald's in Russia and has a very interesting study as a result. Now, how did all this happen? What are the social consequences of McDonald's spreading? And these questions I have been looking at, and also a lot of my Harvard graduate students have been tracking it as well over the years. Now, my personal encounter with Ronald McDonald and McDonald's in China, in this case Hong Kong, was anything but planned. In fact, I resisted it. I didn't really want to study. I'm serious. I did not want to study McDonald's. I had other ideas. What about ancestor worship, Kinship Organization, all the classic examples that anthropologists talk about? People like you fall asleep. But it kept me going for many decades. So what happened is, in 1984, Rubie and I went back to a village where we had lived in on and off since the late 60s, and we were going to take our family, neighbors, out to eat. And we all piled into a taxi, a big mob. We went to the nearby market town. We got out, and I looked up, and there in front of me was the biggest McDonald's I'd ever seen in my life, in the middle of this Chinese market town in the New Territories on the Chinese border, not far from Shenzhen, on the Hong Kong side. And I said, I remember to Rubie, oh God, what am I doing here? I didn't fly all the way from Boston to eat here. And Rubie said, just shut up and eat, which we did. And we've been doing it ever since. And since that time, that experience has led to a research project that I initially resisted and then embraced. Now, I began to track the problem of what do you do about children? How do anthropologists study children? We never study children. They're in the way. You get them out, it's like dogs or chickens. Get the hell out of the way when you're doing research. You don't pay any attention to kids. But in fact, they were beginning to be people. This is a social transformation that you can see happening in a place like Hong Kong. Now, eating out was a new experience for kids. And this is a transformation that's occurred over about the 50 years now, just close on 50 years that we've been doing this research. Here we have birthday parties being held in McDonald's restaurant, again, all over Hong Kong. Why in McDonald's? For two reasons. First, they provide the cake, they provide the food, and most people live in little rabbit warrens that they couldn't possibly have a party even if they wanted to. So McDonald's filled that void and did very nicely in the process. And this also corresponds something in a very interesting way to the fall in birth rates that had happened all over China and East Asia, Hong Kong included. Hong Kong has perhaps the lowest birth rate anywhere on the planet. And so that smaller, child-focused, what anthropologists refer to as conjugal families, looking in on the unit itself, began to emerge. Families were focused on the descending generation, the children, not the ascending generation, namely the elders and the ancestors. And that transformation is really has profound consequences for people's investments, for money, for their plans for the future. Meanwhile, calendrical birth dates, mine is August 6th. I knew it from childhood, and I look forward to it for cakes and things like that. My Chinese friends who are my age have they have no idea when their calendrical birth date is. They become a year older at Lunar New Year. It doesn't matter when they were actually born in the calendar. You go in lockstep year by year. The only people in the past that had birthday parties were elders, men, and not women, men who reached 60 years in the lunar calendar would then have a nice party. Other than that, nobody knew. Nobody cared. But children began to change that. My argument is it's not so much McDonald's, it's the kids who wanted to do it, and hence they all know now. So it's a transformative event. The kids are now center stage. And you can see it all over the world. Here you can see it in McDonald's in Beijing, which opened in 1992. At that time, it was the largest McDonald's in China. And just a few years earlier, Rubie and I had our first encounter in the People's Republic, going across from Hong Kong into People's China. It wasn't until 1978 we were allowed to do that. The first day, I went outside and I saw these kids out marching. Red Guards and young pioneers demonstrating. Now, those of you who are Chinese students or Chinese, who's this guy?
Zhou Enlai, maybe? No.
Try again. Hua Guofeng. Did you know who Hua Guofeng is? You may not, some of you. Hua Guofeng was Mao's immediate successor who lasted not very long and then got tossed out by the Gang of Four, and eventually Deng Xiaoping comes in, et cetera, et cetera. So here's Chairman Mao, and these kids are out marching in the rain that day. Now, take a look at that photo. Here are kids engaged in the revolution. Also interesting, look at what they're wearing on their feet. That says something about China's development. Now, 16 years later, here we have a mother feeding her little emperor, her only single child as a result of Communist Party policy. One child per family, and there he is, the little emperor. Now, this mother could well have been this woman here, 16 years later, with her little emperor. She's the right age for that. In the 1990s, teaching one's singleton child how to be global and connected was extremely important for parents who hoped to get their kids into good schools and eventually into a good job, and if they were lucky, into the Harvard Medical School or something like that. These were ambitions that people had. Note also that the mother is not eating herself. This was expensive food at that time. The most important person in this photo is the little emperor himself. There are also little empresses herself. One of my graduate students wrote a book called Only Hope, which some of you may want to check out. It's really interesting. Only Hope. What happens during a single-child family policy when you have a daughter and no other people to take care of you? And so it's about what happened to those daughters. Now, going back to that photo, I can't resist this. How do you eat a hamburger? Some of you young people who maybe didn't grow up in Iowa, how do you eat a hamburger? Hands, which of course are taboo in many parts of East Asia to touch food. And the idea that you would address a hamburger frontally, pick it up with two hands, open your mouth, and chomp right through it was considered gross and terrible and something that had to be investigated. The kids knew how to do it, and they wanted to practice. Their parents were horrified. Their grandparents would go to McDonald's with them and take a fork and disassemble the hamburger and look at what all this stuff is. The kids learned quickly how to eat. In other words, they wanted to be global. They wanted to be connected. Now, what comes first? Is it family transformation and the emergence of middle classes, or is it the spread of McDonald's? In other words, does McDonald's cause these changes? A lot of people who wrote in the early part of this, the late 20th century, early 21st century, made the argument that McDonald's was intruding itself into foreign cultures and becoming an imperialist force. Well, I think, frankly, at my research, when I started and dug into this, I've come to other conclusions. It's clear to me that family transformation obviously comes first. Nobody's going to buy it, nobody's going to work until there's a market for these things. That transformation occurs. And other issues involved. Because of McDonald's success in China, there were all kinds of imitators. This is my favorite so far. One of my graduate students took this photograph in Shanghai, and this is Nancy's. Notice the N, the other part of the double arches got whacked off. And this serves hamburgers. That's supposedly not. It was pretty good. I don't think it's lasted. By the way, if any of you ever spot any of these, please take a photo and send it to me on email. I'd appreciate it. I collect them. Now, the question is, coming back to that point about what comes first, cultural imperialism. There are many scholars, many careers made by denouncing McDonald's. When I first started this project, it was assumed that I was going to join the denouncers. The point was that as an anthropologist, I study systems. I try not to prejudge them. But that was considered faulty style of research by a lot of critical scholars. But I did so anyway, and the project has found conclusions that are not often comfortable. But the imperialism debate treats McDonald's as the point of the spear. The soft power investigation and transformation of indigenous cultures, it follows it. The idea being that McDonald's and other companies thrust themselves into non-Western societies and transform them. Well, this cartoon from, I think it's the late 90s, says it all. The idea of the capitalist hiding behind the mask of Ronald. Well, there are other evidence of this too, and cultural imperialists would seize on issues like this. This is the sign in the Hong Kong MTR, the subway, that says, no food. Don't take any food on. But you notice what it is? A hamburger and a Coke. It's not a bowl of chopsticks or a banana or something like that. It's this food. So the question is this an example of imperialism? I think it's a little far-fetched to say so. But now, having looked a bit at this question of culinary nationalism and imperialism, let's move to another topic that is more in the news today, and I have another one too that should be right with the topic that I'm going to conclude with, namely soybeans, that will be in the newspaper that you're reading this morning. But let's do rice. Now, what I'm interested in here is taste. Biological sensory taste. Not terroir, as in the French sense of land and territory, but actual physical taste and culinary nationalism. I want to consider rice in Asia. Now, this photo, happily, was loaned to me by Karen, our spokesperson today here. Karen is an excellent photographer, I must say, has a little bit of advertisement. And this is one of her photographs from Vietnam, taken in 2012. What I find interesting about this, if you look at it carefully, it's that most of the varieties for sale are Vietnamese. Now, throughout Asia, local people prefer to eat their own local rice. Furthermore, they can taste the differences in ways that would elude most of us as outsiders. We often really can't taste the difference. In the 1920s, for example, a Shanghai textile mill owners tried to stock their local canteens with a diet of what was known in those days as Saigon rice. Namely, it's this stuff from Vietnam. Local workers preferred the rice of the Yangtze Delta region, which Shanghai is a part. They boycotted this, quote, foul-tasting foreign rice that the management tried to inflict on them, and the locals had to revert to local suppliers. Many other examples of rice. This is French rice, picked up recently across the pond. Basmati rice from India, available in the United States. And this is an interesting one here. California Japanese-style rice, which has actually won blind taste tests in Tokyo. But it's been more or less banned. It's basically become restrictions on foreign rice operating in terms of trade barriers in Japan. So there's a lot of issues surrounding rice. Now, another example is Korea. This cartoon political poster was collected by one of my students from the early 1990s, and it's a Korean Farm Union poster. And what is it about? If you look carefully, Korea was a former colony of the Japanese Empire from 1910 to 1945. And the best strains of Korean rice were shipped out and exported, some of it to Japan. Korean farmers ate inferior varieties of Chinese or Southeast Asian rice. They didn't eat their own rice. The rest of it was imported to other parts of the Japanese Empire. In this political poster, Korean farmers are dredging out foreign or global influences from their local rice paddies and replanting it with indigenous rice. Now, if you look carefully at this photo and unpack it, you will find Rothman cigarettes, British. You will find Coca-Cola, and a can of Spam is lurking in there. The social history of Spam related to the Korean War and the development of a Korean cuisine is an entirely different topic and an interesting one for anyone looking for a good thesis. But here is, I think, a good example of what's happening is they're replanting it, they're getting this stuff out, and they're replanting it with their own rice. Throughout Asia, there's an indigenous belief system that links rice production to the ancestors in a quite literal, almost unsettling sense for those of us who are outsiders. Ancestors are often buried near paddies or in the hills nearby, and they're thought to be ever present in the land itself and influencing the process of production. Chinese refer to this as feng shui in Cantonese, feng shui in Mandarin. The idea being wind and waters are influenced by the ancestors. Well, you find ideologies like that all over East Asia. So rice is not just about what's in the field, it's about family, it's about tradition, it's about ancestors, it's about the national identity. Chinese villagers, the people that I know most, Cantonese speakers, always preferred their own local variety of high-quality rice. But until the late 20th century, farmers rarely ate their own high-quality rice. The best varieties of rice were sold to local rice buyers like Mr. Chun here, my old friend in Santin Village. and then it was shipped off. In the urbanites and wealthy migrants and Chinese in places like Singapore and San Francisco ate the highest quality long grain Guangdong-style rice. In other words, if you wanted to find the rice near the area where I did my field work and you wanted to eat it, you'd go to a place like San Francisco and it'd be for sale at enormous prices that the rich Chinese in San Francisco would buy. Well, in the 1980s, by the way, China finally opened its borders to Hong Kong people, and visitors began to go across the border. Hong Kong millionaires began to drive their Rolls Royces just across the border up to Panyu County in the Pearl River Delta, and they stopped at dumpy little roadside stands where they would squat with the local farmers and they would eat heaping bowls of steamed, fresh, harvested rice. First crop Panyu rice. Now, if you've never had anything like this, you will know what taste means and the aroma of the first crop. This is truly food for the gods. So that this stuff is really extremely important. However, Delta farmers themselves rarely, if ever, ate their own rice. They ate primarily a diet of jok, Cantonese term that is perhaps best translated as gruel, jok. By the way, I always prefer country Cantonese, the literal gutsiness, groundedness of Cantonese versus the national dialect of Mandarin. Jok is comprised of broken rice left over from the harvest, sweet potatoes, bits of leftover vegetables, and whatever else they can find to throw in, which is then cooked together into a soupy gruel. And glop, essentially, is what people ate most of the time. Until the mid-1960s, bowls of steamed rice, like the one I described that the millionaires are driving to eat, was reserved for festivals and banquets. Local farmers would eat it 2 or 3 times a year, and that was it. Well, this slide here reminds me, perhaps more than anything, of the years that I spent in the Delta in rice country. And you can still see sites like this. This is taken from 1978 in Guangdong area. But it's a water buffalo with the farmer lonesome plowing the rice fields. And you could see these kind of sites all over China. What I think is interesting now is to see what is going to happen to the future of rice production in places like the Pearl River Delta and other parts of China. And what are we going to have Iowa, Illinois style farms with thousands of acres basically planted and harvested by robots? Don't forget that we have rice fields in Texas that are planted by airplane, seeded by airplane. Is this the future of agriculture in China? Many of my former students are tracking this, I'm happy to say, and they're finding interesting things in the pig market in particular, which I'll talk about here. But at this point, I think it's time to move from South China, as much as I really would like to stay there. And let's look at Western Illinois and the international soybean trade. So the soybean harvest of Henry County, Illinois, is what I want to discuss now. I now live in Henry County in retirement on a family farm, surrounded by an unruly mob of affines, which is the anthropological term for in-laws. Now, given the nature of contemporary American farming, as you know, being Iowans, there are 2 dominant crops, maize, corn, and soybeans. Now, many of you know where I'm heading. Roundup, the Monsanto Corporation, and the revolution in the soybean and corn trade. This really hit American agriculture in a big way around the turn of the century and somewhat earlier. By now, approximately 100% of Henry County soybeans are Roundup ready, meaning that they produce only genetically modified soybeans. It's almost impossible to produce non-GMO soybeans because, as I'll talk about in a bit, pollen flow. Now, as you know, Monsanto owns Roundup, and it also sells the seeds that resist Roundup. And here is a herbicide sprayer of the type you can find all over Iowa, and it's in our neighborhood. When we see one of these coming, we go inside and shut the door and shut the windows until the wind can disperse it, because it will basically spray the entire countryside. It kills, as I said, anything that grows other than the soybean itself, which has been genetically modified. A high percentage of Henry County's beans are now transported down the Mississippi at New Boston Port along the Mississippi for export or processing elsewhere, primarily into oil or meal. Not too much of it is consumed locally except in perhaps hog confinements. But incidentally, approximately 90% of Henry County's corn crop now is turned into ethanol in 2 nearby county-based ethanol plants. And the remaining 10% of corn is fed to local hogs in confinement facilities. Now, U.S. exports to China are very much at issue. They peaked in 2012, according to the New York Times and other sources, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but they began to drop in 2015, and now they're still fluctuating. Canada has now recovered its place as the largest market for U.S. agricultural exports. But meanwhile, Brazil and Argentina, as I hinted at earlier, are raising their soybean production. And it will probably exceed the total of exports that China is importing fairly soon. Now I want to switch to Japan and the project, again, of one of my students. I'm sorry to keep talking about my students, but I think they're superb. And I would say that, wouldn't I? But I'm interested in Canadian non-GMO soybeans for the Japanese market. And this was a study that was done by, as I said, I'll show you in a minute. And if you look carefully at this bag of beans, it's the Canadian flag, a Canadian emblem, and it's non-GMO soybeans. And here's the term right there, meaning non-genetically modified soybeans here. And this is the work of Gavin Whitelaw on Canadian farmers and Japanese buyers and Japanese producers. If any of you, by the way, are interested in this project, or this paper, or others that I've written, let me know by email and I can send you PDFs. That this is a really interesting, important article. Gavin Whitelaw tracked the beans. First, he spent a lot of time in the Canadian outback in Ontario. Why in Ontario, of all places? That's where you can grow non-GMO soybeans because it's far, far away from American winds that are going to carry the pollen that will essentially pollute any nearby soybean field. And hence, you got to go to the outback of Ontario where they produce soybeans of this nature. And so Gavin studied the soybean producers and then followed the beans to Japan, to this little mom and pop shop here in the countryside of Japan. Now, Japanese bean curd producers will pay enormous prices for these non-GMO beans that come in per bag. And Gavin spent the entire year working in one of these places, and hence, as you would imagine, his Japanese is exquisite. He now serves as an interpreter for both sides, the bean producers and the buyers. Well, if you try this deep-fried bean curd from these little places, you will discover what bean curd really should be like. It's fantastic. It's utterly good. It costs a fortune to buy this stuff, even by local standards, but people will do it. And they will not eat genetically modified soybeans. And the fresh bean curd is especially good, unlike anything you can find. Now, so the Japanese market has become almost exclusively non-GMO for human production. However, if you look to other parts of Asia, this is Hong Kong, a bean curd hawker on the streets of Kowloon. You can find these all over China. That you don't really know what kind of soybeans you're getting, and then most of it is no doubt genetically modified. The Chinese consumer, unlike their Japanese neighbors, are less concerned. Korean consumers are very concerned. Japanese are concerned. The Chinese less so. Now, Beyond the Bean is a magazine that's produced by the American Soybean Council that goes to all my neighbors. They read it religiously. They can quote from it. The exports to China have become a leading preoccupation of my neighbors. They read all this material. They follow the international markets every day on the internet. And there are specialized radio broadcasts that I didn't even know existed. That is the minutia of the corn market that some of these radio programs are. It's really amazing when you look at it from an outsider's perspective. My neighbors are well informed to a very high degree of specialization in terms of the international market. They could hold their own with any of the commentators that you hear tonight on Market to Market on PBS, or this evening on the PBS Business Day. They really are well attuned. And what happens to their soybeans is a big issue to them. And in China, it is as well, because a great deal of the American soybeans are heading to China and elsewhere. The question is, can we keep up that demand? Meanwhile, China has a problem. The problem is called contaminated food, poisoned food, downright dangerous food. It is really quite dangerous in some respects to eat in many parts of China. People in Hong Kong, where this is sold, this is the American American pork chop sold in a Hong Kong supermarket at really quite a price, considering that it's a very small piece of pork. And why are people buying this? It's because they don't want to touch anything from China. People in Hong Kong are very wary of Chinese materials. And if you are to do a survey, you will find, for instance, that Rubie did an informal survey the last time we were in Hong Kong of this supermarket and found 2 items in the entire store of food, fresh food from China. One was onions, and the other was white potatoes. And the onions weren't selling very well. So Hong Kong consumers will eat almost anything, and they will pay vast prices for Australian and food from California and elsewhere. But meanwhile, the demand for meat in China is booming. By 2020, according to many sources, China will account for maybe over 40%, some say 50%, of new demand for meat in the world, and 25% of all new demand for grain to feed that livestock. So it's all sucking out of the world into the Chinese meat market, essentially, is what's happening. Can we compete? Well, there's a Chinese ban, for instance, on hormones, growth hormones, and only about 25 to 30% of U.S. hogs qualify. And I know this personally because I have neighbors who've tried to break into the Chinese export market, but they can't pass the drug tests. It's not them, it's their pigs can't pass the test. Meanwhile, everybody in China wants to eat meat. And there's always a fear of contamination. Some of you will also know about this development, if you recall, from 2013, when a Chinese corporation, essentially a government-sponsored corporation, bought Smithfield. Now, Smithfield hams are kind of an icon for many American consumers, but it's now Chinese-owned. And the question is, what's going to happen? There's ideas that somehow Chinese pork will be re-imported back into the market. That's not going to happen, according to the people who are following this market. But it does mean that the entire food world and industry is being shaken up. We don't really know what's going to happen. We have seen only the beginning of the shakeups in this world market. And major changes are afoot, and it's very unclear how the current administration in Washington is going to react and what will be the consequences for American producers. China cannot really hope to produce enough food to feed its demanding and increasingly affluent urban population. There's big demands. And China has to look elsewhere if it's going to feed itself. And will they look to America, to producers like my Henry County neighbors? Just a couple of days ago, I was talking to one of our neighbors who told me, quote, "We are counting on China," end quote. Well, let's hope it pays off for him. Or, after increasingly acrimonious trade negotiations, will the Chinese government look to other producers in places like Brazil, Argentina, Canada, Australia, and yes, Mexico? Well, we saw just yesterday, or 2 days ago on television, Senator Joni Ernst from this state talking about NAFTA and the importance to American producers, and particularly Iowa farmers. That's all a problem, and it's an issue that's in the front of everyone's mind here. Meanwhile, too, you have this development. You probably saw it recently, just a few days ago, a week or two ago, in the New York Times and elsewhere, where the China National Chemical Corporation, which is a stand-in for the Chinese government, is seeking to acquire Syngenta, the Swiss agribusiness company, quote, one of the world's largest producers of seeds and pesticides. Well, how do we conclude this talk? In the flyer that was sent out, and I suspect I see Karen's hand in producing that flyer and that proposal, she asked, I think somebody asked, I don't know whether I did, maybe, will China eat our lunch, it asks. You, the residents of Iowa, have a front row seat to observe these developments that I've been describing. Speaking as a native Iowan myself, having grown up in a little town and that's still there, more or less, I do hope that all this goes well for us and you in Iowa. However, I must confess that I'm nervous. Given the dark storm clouds that are descending on world politics in recent months, I'm concerned about where the American food production is heading. Culinary nationalism today is a serious business with ramifications that affect entire economies. It is no longer the subject matter of back-page cooking sections of local newspapers, or, for that matter, the musings of anthropologists who publish in obscure academic journals of the type that I prefer and end up publishing in. The politics of food will henceforth be covered in the front pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post. So, you can't help but read all about it every morning with your genetically modified cereal. So thank you very much for your attention.
What about that Roundup? Is it becoming less effective?
Good question. Yes, thank you. That's a very good question. Roundup. When it first came out, it was considered to be the miracle cure, and it would kill everything except the soybeans. Well, that's no longer the case. In Henry County, where I live now, and anywhere, you can begin to see weeds that are beginning to creep into the soybean fields after the spray. And these are Roundup-resistant weeds that have come up from the south. As climate change is on us, I mean, I'd hate to bring that question up, but I'm sorry, it is with us. You will find that there are going to be increasing number of migration of plants coming into Iowa fields and even farther on, which means that Roundup fields today now require different kinds of sprays, and there are an entire industry like Syngenta that I mentioned and others, Monsanto, that are trying to create new sprays. One thing that was interesting about Roundup is, and I think it's probably true, when it first came out, it did reduce the number of pesticides that was required to produce crops. But with these new developments, who knows whether in the future there will be multiple spraying, just as there was before Roundup.
Were there any disputes in Taiwan over the kinds of rice grown or preferred by people from the mainland in the years immediately after 1949?
Yeah, very good question. I spent time in Taiwan studying Mandarin when I was somewhat younger. And there was always a complaint. The local mainlanders, Daluren, people from the mainland, Waisheng, outside, people born outside, that the local rice wasn't good enough, and they would wax lyrically about Shanghai rice and elsewhere. I think now what's happened in Taiwan, and it's another interesting topic for anyone looking for a thesis topic, all of you, younger people, is what's happened to such things as sweet potatoes in Taiwan. Now the sweet potato has become the identity of Taiwan national force. Whereas in the past, only people would eat sweet potatoes because they had to. It was enforced. Now it's become a matter of identity, a kind of negative embracing of a negative force. And as for rice, well, I'm sorry. I think that's a project that someone else needs to do, but it's a very good one. Taiwanese rice versus other Chinese rice. But I suspect that there's a lot of taste and nationalism involved in this.
It seems that the fast food restaurants become domesticated, adopt the local style of cuisines when they enter another country or culture, e.g., Chinese-style food in McDonald's, orange chicken, etc. How might this exchange impact the culinary nationalism?
Yes, that's a very good question. And you can see that developing. The longer McDonald's stays abroad in a country, the more it gets transformed. You can see it in the menu. It begins by offering American food, which is all new and trendy, as you saw from that earlier slide I showed of Beijing, where that was the trendiness. Now, gradually, you'll find the Chinese varieties of food being offered. And one of the challenges to researchers would be to track McDonald's menus around the world, and it would be an interesting project. I don't want to do it, but I hope somebody does. But it would be interesting to see how McDonald's becomes domesticated. And does any of that ever come back? Not to my knowledge. There's another question, too. Well, I won't bring it up. It has to do with who's eating at McDonald's. In East Asia, it used to be the kids. Now it's older people are beginning to come to McDonald's. Comfort food. When you travel in this country, when Rubie and I are driving around, when we stop at McDonald's because we know there's going to be a restroom there and you can get coffee, who's at McDonald's in most of the interior of this country? Dare I say it, it's people who have hair that looks like mine, meaning not much, or white. Basically, it's becoming an elder center during most of the day in this country. So there's another topic to look at how systems are transformed over just a few generations, a few decades, sorry.
Please comment a bit more on diseased or difficult Chinese food.
Yes, diseased or I should say adulterated food. It's all the time. All you have to do is get on Google and type in poison food China, and you'll find dozens of articles in Chinese and in English about how all kinds of problems. There was a major milk scandal that some of you may recall a few years ago, in which powdered milk was adulterated and killed a number of kids. Everybody freaked out completely and stopped using Chinese manufactured milk. And there was a run on Hong Kong imported powdered milk. And the Chinese government had to impose restrictions on how many cartons of milk you could take across the border. And there was smuggling of milk powder in many parts of the world. Even in London, there was a restriction on how many boxes of powdered milk you could buy because Chinese visitors were loading up suitcases of it. as a consequence. Well, there's all kinds of there's example of poisoned meats, poisoned fish, you name it. It's become a really serious problem. The issue is that Chinese producers, most of the small farmers, put far too much fertilizer and far too much insecticide and other kinds of poisons on their fields. And so they would never pass restrictions in most parts of the world.
As you noted, states like Iowa have been well colonized by international companies like Monsanto. Do you think the new nationalism could change these dynamics?
Well, that's an interesting question. I hadn't thought of Iowa being a colony, but I suppose you could say that these companies have moved in a big way. But I think that Iowa is now becoming not monocrop. Could one call it duocrop? But soybeans and corn, very much like the county in Illinois where I live. And as long as that is the dominant driver of the economy, it's vulnerable to all kinds of social issues. And what's happening in Washington and the storm clouds over war with Korea can definitely affect the market very much, as you can see, probably tonight. I don't know if that's much of an answer, but I don't think, in the sense that Iowa might be colonized, it's self-induced by this kind of duocrop mentality. But then the question is, how are you going to grow anything that anybody wants to buy other than corn and soybeans? It's catch-22.
Okay, this will be the last question. Are there really no don't eat signs that depict rice, tortillas, kebabs, etc.? Are all countries guilty of food chauvinism?
That would be an interesting project, to go around the world and look at don't eating signs. There you go. Don't bring in food. Yes, that's a great topic. And I don't really have any answer except the ones I've seen. I can't remember one that has a bowl. Of course, you don't take a bowl of rice with chopsticks on board the subway. What else? We have to think about that. But that's a good project.
All right, this concludes our program, and I want to thank Woody again for a very interesting topic and presentation. I also, yeah, we can clap. I also want to thank our sponsors again, the University of Iowa's International Programs, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization. Also, our special financial sponsors, Midwest One Bank and Karen and Wally Chapel. We also thank City Channel 4 for making our programs available to viewing audiences. So now, Woody, as a small token of our appreciation, I want to give you this coveted Iowa City mug.
Where's my coveted mug?
Right here.
Ah. Thank you.
So, thank you again, and we are adjourned.